Welcome back to Virtual Selling, an educational web series from Sparks IQ. This is episode 3, Front Stage Best Practices. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at a clip of my hero. Who says you can't have fun and work at the same time? Today, we're talking about front stage best practices like don't spill your margarita. Mark, let's start with you. One of the ways to have a great front stage performance is to know what to offload to backstage. So how should a sales rep determine what to offload to backstage and what to keep in the agenda for their front stage meetings?
Well, first, what I would tell you is that in general, you need to think in terms of what we call the 1/3 rule. And that is, if you would normally be meeting someone in person for a 60-minute session, you need to think in the virtual world, 1/3 of that. So you actually have 20 minutes to be able to communicate your message. 60 minutes is just too long for most virtual meetings. People can't keep their attention up and they don't want to participate for that period of time unless it's absolutely necessary. So less is more. So if you start with the constraint of the 1/3 rule, that you're going to try to do what you might otherwise do in an hour-long meeting, and just think about it for a moment, Jason. You walk into someone's office, you shake hands, then you have a seat, and then you get settled, and then you take your pen out and your paper, and then, there's all of this time in the in-person interaction. And then they have to walk you out after the meeting, and they walk you all the way to the door, and then they walk back. A lot of time is absorbed. In the virtual meeting, we don't have any of that. So being able to cut to the chase makes a difference. One example of something that you can offload is simplifying the process of the agenda and simplifying the process of introductions. And the two ways to do that are A, sending a welcome video that includes the agenda as an item, or sending an email with the agenda. And then just for those people who didn't see the email, to take the agenda, drop it in the chat, and let people know that you're going to use this as the framework to manage the meeting. It gives you permission to, in effect, cut people off to make sure it doesn't go on too long. So that's the first big thing. The second big thing I mentioned was the notion, if there's 10 people on the call, to be able to take just a screenshot of the top of their LinkedIn, which is their face, their name, their title, and their company. Just that information can get you 80% of the way there. In this example, you send that out in advance of the call with the agenda and say, attached, please find the LinkedIn screenshots from the 10 participants who will be on this call. And then finally, when people get on the call, if you say to them, I'd like you to go to the 3 buttons using Zoom as an example and click rename and rename yourself with name and title and company. Just by doing that, you've literally saved 15 minutes on a call that has 10 people. That's the kind of thinking that allows you to be more efficient and actually create a better experience.
Jason, if I can add to that too, something I've kind of evolved to and encourage those on our team to do the same is if there's anything that is a verbatim explanation that's the same way every time. So explaining features and benefits of a product, it sounds simple, but that kind of stuff, some of that can be offloaded even before a meeting. I actually prefer a buyer to come into a meeting knowing what our product does, exactly where there might be fit, and then spend that time collaborating and actually figuring out the fit, the alignment, and tailoring that conversation rather than starting at the beginning and saying, well, we have a product that does this. And it's for us, it's almost comical because what we sell is we sell virtual online training that's video produced. There's no reason they can't just see some of that video before they come to that meeting. At that point, I don't need to explain, well, we do online video training, because that's just such a waste. I'd rather have them see what it is, understand it, and then we can come in and talk about how it fits for them. And so some of the lines I've been trying to draw between front stage and backstage are around, is it something that's just a standard explanation of something? Okay, that can probably, pieces of that can be either be sent beforehand or as a follow-up. And let's spend that valuable time, to Mark's point, with the client actually collaborating on how we can help them specifically.
It's such a richer experience to use the time live for the purpose of collaboration, brainstorming, interaction, versus, as Doug pointed out, the rote, I'll call it boring, standard, that everyone could be consuming on their own. It can make a meeting much more dynamic, where it's not just someone talking, but rather using the time for interaction.
David, what do you think about the idea of reps offloading certain things they would normally do in person to backstage?
Well, I think there's a lot of great opportunities to take things out of live meetings and to offer them through new technologies to the buyers or the buying committee ahead of time. Anything that's repetitive, anything that involves specialists, anything that involves, let's say, very complex technical jargon that's only interesting to one of the buying committee members, all those types of content are better served backstage before the face-to-face meeting.
So, Mike, get in on this, man. How might a rep differentiate between presentations to offload to backstage versus those that should be included in the front stage agenda?
Sure. Well, some presentations can be uploaded and stepped through by the buyer on their own because they're very straightforward and there's a low risk of confusion or misinterpretation. When it's just knowledge sharing or less complex material, it can be also used as pre-work or post-work to a live synchronous call or a video meeting. This works really well, by the way, for summaries, whether they're in text after the meeting or video or some hybrid of that. Other things, Jason, I think really are best presented live. This is especially true if there are issues that you want to convey in a particular way, or if you want to multi-thread, right, or personalize your messaging for these multiple personas and buyers who have different issues or outcomes. Or maybe it's something that requires discussion, decisions, Q&A, back and forth, some time of engagement. Those are obviously all best done live. It's really about picking the right tool and the right approach for the task at hand.
What is a best practice if you need to step through a slide presentation? Should you just read all the text that's on the slide straight to the viewer?
Well, I'd say no, Jason. No, you don't want to bore them to tears. No, you shouldn't just read your slide to them. But you do want to have all the information that they need, right? And so sometimes I think this is a case-by-case, buyer-by-buyer evaluation that you need to make. I try to use enough text that people can understand what I said when they're looking at it a week later. If you do the Steve Jobs thing, right, where you share a pretty image and talk for 20 minutes, next week, no one's going to remember what that was all about. If you're using PowerPoint or Google Slides, remember, you could add text into the slide notes for them as well, or you can even make a brief voiceover video. Different people will have different preferences, but your default intent should be to support your buyers and help them make an easy and frictionless buying decision.
Yeah, I think it's important for people who are presenting with slides to keep in mind that many of the buyers who may be on the call may not have access to video or may have poor access to those types of intermittent access to those types of tools. So whenever you're using slides, it's important to be aware of who is and who isn't able to see the content and make sure that you adapt your presentation mode to those realities.
Speaking of reality, I think there are some myths floating around about virtual selling. So let's take a minute to do some debunking. Mark, there's a myth out there that it's hard to build rapport virtually. You mentioned in your book this idea of the virtual selling curve. So can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on whether it is difficult to build rapport virtually?
Well, Jason, look, I think like anything in life, it's harder to do something that you haven't done many times before when you compare it to something that you've done a lot of times before. So most of us, by the time we've started our sales career, we're used to meeting people in person. We're used to shaking their hands. We know certain social customs. So all things being equal, in many people's mind, that's easier than doing it virtually. What actually ends up happening is that when you understand some of the keys in mastering virtual selling, you realize that there are certain things that you can do before a meeting to start the rapport building process, so that when you actually get on camera with that other person, you've gotten to know them a little bit and they've gotten to know you a little bit. A simple example of this is connecting on LinkedIn before you meet somebody for the first time on your call. So now all of a sudden you know a little bit about them, they know a little bit about you. And to pivot over to Doug for a moment, if they happen to be sitting in an office or a home office, you've in a sense been invited into their home in some cases or their office, and you can take a look and get to know a little bit about who they are. So a lot of the principles of building rapport that people already know, they just hadn't fully realized you can apply in this arena just as you could in the in-person arena.
That's right. So, Doug, do you want to add anything to this idea of building rapport virtually?
Yeah, I actually, an interesting story is even before the pandemic, we had a training course on building stronger customer relationships on the market.
The art and science of building successful business relationships.
And one of the interesting things we started getting asked after the pandemic hit was, well, does this apply to virtual relationships? And as it happens, we taught a series of approaches and methodologies that you could use however you want. It could be over the phone, it could be in person, it could be over a conference call. And, the things we teach are, establishing credibility, being authentic, having integrity in what you're doing, things like that. And those are really the foundations of strong business relationships. So those are some additional things in addition to, kind of the personal stuff that Mark brought up to really get to know somebody. Those are the things you're doing to actually establish a strong relationship anyway. And there's no reason you can't do that strategically in a remote setting the same way you could in person. I guess the only thing you couldn't do is bring donuts. And if you're in a business where your relationships are a result of bringing donuts, well, find a different way or send donuts delivery, I guess.
You got to do the meeting kit like Mark talks about in his book. The meeting kit for some of our customers would be a case of donuts.
That's right. You can get anything delivered these days. That's one of the great outcomes of a pandemic.
Mike, I think you may have some thoughts on this idea as well. Not the donuts, but the larger points. So would you like to share any thoughts on it?
Sure, Jason. Whenever you're selling, trust and engagement really matter, as does what we call AIR.
AIR stands for awareness, interest, and relationship. And nurturing is building your value stack until the prospect is ready to engage.
These things lead to real relationships, and virtually, these things also must be managed purposefully because they do not always happen organically in virtual meetings or emails or chats or other asynchronous communication. But if you're purposeful about it, you absolutely can pull it off. And the way I like to think about it is just that acting human builds trust in relationships, especially in the age of technology, right? So we call these the human differentiators. They're things like empathy or authenticity, being transparent, simple stuff like kindness and manners, active listening, doing the things you say you will, which builds trust, paying attention to what matters most to the other person, speaking the right value language for your buyers, working together to co-create solutions, your facilitating skills to engage people, and only using ethical influence and persuasion in operating in your buyer's best interest. When I talk about needing to sell the way that our buyers want to buy, this is the exact stuff that I'm talking about. If you act confident and are competent, that builds credibility and trust and respect. But this stuff also includes consultative skills, good judgment, critical thinking, problem solving, sharing data and insights. This is all stuff that buyers tell us in research that they want from sales reps, helping people connect dots, really understanding their solution, but better than that, tying the outcomes to what the buyers want and need. So I think, Jason, especially when selling virtually, sellers need to state their intent clearly about this buyer centricity. They need to show concern for the other person, engage and facilitate almost as a servant leader to help them get what they want and to ensure that these things come across purposefully in both synchronous and asynchronous communication. If you do this stuff well, you'll have great results, whether you're in the same room, selling through Zoom, or selling from Mars with Elon Musk. It's absolutely possible to build real relationships virtually.
Well, I have to say, as we're thinking about this, just because it's difficult for us or perhaps impossible to replicate that face-to-face experience, doesn't mean we're going to have the luxury of going back to face-to-face. So fundamentally, what we have to do is dig in and try to find the best ways to use new technology and new approaches to engagement to be able to try to build those connections that we know are so valuable.
Here's my take. If it's so hard to build rapport virtually, then how come we got people out there on the internet falling in love with avatars? I mean, ask them if it's hard to build rapport virtually. You know what their answer is going to be? I do. So, without objection, we are going to declare this myth debunked. Mark, David, Doug, Mike. Do we feel like using people's names is a good thing?
Absolutely, Jason. Yeah, I think we have to be realistic, but I think that is one of the techniques that's important to master when you're selling virtually. Is that, so is setting things up, right? I might say, hey, Jason, in a minute, I'm going to ask you about XYZ, but before I do that, and then I go on to something. Now, all of a sudden, you've sat up straighter. You're really perked up because you know you're going to get asked about XYZ. And sometimes when you're facilitating virtually, those techniques can really help people engage better. And you don't want to overuse the names, Jason, right? Because when you do that, Jason, it sounds kind of phony, Jason. But you want to use names more often, and you want to use facilitation methods to make sure that they're engaged, leaning in, and know what's coming, so they can prepare for it and feel good about it.
And I would add to that, even bigger is if you're in a call where you have a number of different buyers involved on the other side of the call, you need to use that technique to just bring them in and have them be an active part of the conversation. And that goes back to meeting, call planning and meeting management, knowing who's on the call, what they need to get out of the call, and what their perspective is in the buying decision they're making, so that you can call on them in the areas where it's appropriate and get them involved and get them engaged, rather than just having one person you're interacting back and forth with and having everybody else just watching. That's a very important piece of it as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important when you have a buying committee that you're trying to address through virtual selling is to be conscious of each of the personas who are attending from the buyer side and to address their potential needs, their potential problems that they're trying to solve directly. So there's going to be certain people who are on a call who maybe don't speak up. They don't ask any questions. They're just basically passive participants. That doesn't mean they're not an important part of the buying committee. So we need to make sure that we recognize during a virtual meeting that we engage those people. We need to make sure that we make an effort to engage each of the personas, regardless of whether they're proactively engaging. We need to call them in, because if they don't express their opinions, if they're not engaged, we know a lot of bad things can happen in the sales process. We have to engage every one of the buyers on the buying committee. If they're invited to the meeting, we have to expect there was a reason, and ultimately they will have an influence on whether the buying process moves forward.
That's a great point. And there is a facilitation technique that they teach you in facilitator school, where as soon as possible in a meeting, you try to get everybody to say something, whether you're just trying to do some pre-meeting chat or warm up, or whether you purposely are asking somebody a question. The sooner in that meeting that you can get someone speaking up, the better it's going to be for engagement throughout that meeting.
Just to go back a second, there's a facilitator school?
There is, and it's there that I learned the art of the transition. Let's hear some best practices for scheduling and time management. Mark, now that we're scheduling more meetings than before, do you have any recommendations for how people should go about scheduling their days now that they're probably going to be able to pack in more meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can tell you that human beings in general are not designed to be nonstop on camera for 8 hours a day. If you think about it, the best actors in Hollywood are never, literally, they're not on camera for 8 hours a day. There's very strict rules around how they work. But even still, if you're the star actor, you start, you stop, you take a break, things are moving around. So this idea that we're just staring into a camera all the time, it is fatiguing. And so a couple of examples that have developed in this post-pandemic time are for calls that are regular calls with teams, it's totally okay to announce at the beginning of the call or even in the meeting invitation, camera optional. And so there's a number of meetings that I'm part of that there's people who are just not on camera. And if they want to speak up, they can turn their camera on, join at that moment, make their point, and then drop back off. There's a number of times where I'm eating lunch, for example, and I don't want to be on camera while I'm eating lunch. And I'll tell people I'm eating lunch, I'm camera off right now. So I found that for most people, 4 hours a day to be camera on is enough. You can push that, but what we've learned is that regardless of whether you're doing this 4 hours a day or you're doing it longer, you've got to be able to schedule to have a break, because otherwise it's inhumane. You cannot go from call to call to call without food, water, a bathroom break. Otherwise, you're not at your best self.
That's great. I would also going back to the idea of buyer-centric front stage selling. If I'm a buyer and I'm on call after call and you're selling to me and you're getting to the point, you've got an agenda, I know what we're doing. Instead of 90 minutes, you're only scheduling an hour and you only use 50 minutes of it. I mean, that sounds pretty buyer-centric to me.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to show worthy intent towards your prospects and buyers is to actually give them back time in their day. We all know the endless Ferris wheel of Zoom meetings that most people are on. Anytime you can give the buyer back 9 minutes in their day, 10 minutes in their day, 12 minutes in their day, those minutes are appreciated. So one of the things that I like to do is if we're going to have a standardized meeting, let's say of 45 minutes, I want to be done at 30 or 36 minutes so that I can give time back to that person. People appreciate that. And that's really how you show worthy intent, is understanding the pressures, understanding the daily demands that people are going through in this new virtual world.
I love that point, because guess what? You remember the people who say, let's end this call with 5 minutes to spare, 10 minutes to spare, whatever the time is, versus sort of feeling like you had to use it up just because that was what was originally on your calendar. So this is definitely a case, less is more. And by the way, when you run late, you not only put the person who you're talking to out, but the person who's then waiting for them. So it's a cascading effect.
That's right. I also want to say something about hybrid, because sometimes we're going to be in-person meetings, but like you said, Mark, there will likely be a key stakeholder that's going to be there virtually on a laptop. And I think what you said in your book is don't treat them like a potted plant. Don't treat them like a potted plant. So let's talk about a front stage best practice. If you're responsible for a meeting, make sure that everyone that's in the meeting is involved. Anything you guys want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we have to be realistic about what's going on the buyer side as well. So we know that everybody is struggling with work from home challenges. They may have deliveries, they may have kids, they may have doorbells and dogs and all these other things. So while it is important for us to try to engage everybody who's on the buyer side, we also have to be realistic or pragmatic and understand that they may not be able to participate at exactly the moment in time that we want them to. So we need to make a note of that and make sure we don't neglect to engage them, but we also have to understand that the timing may not be what we want.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And Jason, one of the things that I personally do in that situation is I'll call on someone, but not in a way to put them on the spot. And I might say, for example, Jason, in a moment, I'd love to get your comment on that if you're able to do that. And then, you'll either come off mute or you won't. And to David's point, I do favor the people who are on camera so that I can see that, they're engaged. I think the biggest issue is if you're in person and you're with other members of the buyer's team who are in person, it's to not forget to circle back to that other person who is on the Zoom box. And I will tell you that there's a number of firms that we work with who are now consciously, even when you've got a hybrid meeting, as you've just described it, they're having everyone go on to Zoom because it democratizes the communication, rather than one person has the advantage of being there physically with their body and can sort of command the room, and someone else is off just on a tiny little box. You bring everybody into this, and now, in a sense, everyone has the same 2 inches of space.
All right, Doug, so I got to ask you a question about screen share because we're talking best practices here. So what for you would you say is a best practice with regard to sharing your screen in these meetings?
Well, I think it's necessary in a lot of cases that you need to show a visual of something. I actually think Microsoft did us a disservice years ago when they set up the standard that a PowerPoint slide should have a title and 3 bullets, because it's created generations of bad habits about what it is to share a visual support for a conversation. So that's my own personal opinion, but I would say use them when they're needed to explain and show something. Don't overdo them. Be conscious of the amount of slides, if you're going to be showing slides, that you're going to be showing for the amount of time, so that you're not just overloading it with information and then feeling forced to go through all of the slides that are in there because they're in sequence. So, be very conscious of the amount of slides and the amount of minutes you want to present. If you have 45 slides in a 1 hour meeting, you're just going to be talking the whole time and not hearing the buyer. So be very conscious of that. And also, to that point, stop screen sharing if it's a conversation. I've seen a lot of meetings where there is just a slide that's up on the screen and it's lingering. And the row of people talking are this little sliver at the top of your screen. And then everybody's staring at the same thing that's not moving. And it's not even a part of that conversation anymore. Speaking of screen share, make sure you're sharing the window that you want to be sharing instead of your entire screen if you can, because I have seen people go in and start looking at their email inbox. I've seen some stuff that probably they didn't want to be shown on the call be shown. So not only are they sharing stuff that shouldn't be shared in that call, but they're just broadcasting to everybody on that call that they're not paying attention.
Agreed. And now it is time to hear from my colleague, Jeanette Abrahamson, with some advice on how to make yourself look great for your front stage meetings. Jeanette, let's talk tech.
I'm Jeanette with Sparks IQ. These tech tips will help you light up any Zoom or Teams or whatever virtual meeting platform you use. Good lighting can make your video presence so much better, and most people overlook an incredible source of natural light. If you have a window or sliding glass door in your workspace, get as close to it as you can. Closer, closer. Okay, stop, that's too close. My desk faces these glass doors so that I can take advantage of all of this natural light. The glass also helps diffuse the light a little bit. If the sunlight gets too harsh, I'll just close my linen curtains. I actually got these just because I wanted something that would block all of the harsh light, but let enough in so that I could still host my virtual meetings here. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is turning their backs on natural light. Most of the time, if you have a bright light source behind you, that light will shoot directly into your camera lens and it will automatically close, which makes your face even harder to see. Usually, you'll end up with a silhouette where your face doesn't have enough light.
And unless you want everyone in your meeting thinking they're watching an episode of 60 Minutes, turn around and face that light.
My next tip is to invest in an LED light. A little ring light can go a long way. And they come in a bunch of different sizes and price points, so you can find one that's right for you. I picked this one because of these great features. This button lets me dim or brighten the light. This one lets me change the color temperature. Ever wonder how some people's virtual backgrounds actually look real? One reason is that their light is the same color temperature. Light is on a scale from cool to warm. Blue light is cold. Orange light is warm. I try to match my ring light color temperature to my virtual background. This light also came with a small tripod that lets me adjust the height of my light. If you have one light, try to place it directly behind your web camera. Try your best to keep your light at eye level and keep your eyes in the top third of your screen. Good lighting and good framing go hand in hand. Instead of making this common mistake, reduce your headroom. I know that's not technically about lighting, but I couldn't resist sneaking in a bonus tip. If you have more than one light, you can place one on either side of your webcam. If you really want to look good, I'll give you a tip I used when I was a TV producer. TV anchors have an extra little light on their desk that help remove shadows under their chin. You definitely don't need to go that far to look good on camera. The most important thing is that you start paying attention to your lighting and put your natural light sources to work for you so they're not working against you.
More great tips from Jeanette. Thank you. I also want to thank Mark, Mike, David, and Doug for sharing all of those front stage best practices. And one final best practice for you, close the window.
Good Thursday morning, a bird just flew into my house. Well, that makes for good TV. Good morning, everyone. It's a crazy morning over here at my residence, but we have some cloudy skies over there this morning. Sorry about that, folks. Just had a bird fly through my door. I had my door open for my talk this morning.
All right, our next episode is all about backstage selling, so go out there, break a leg front stage, and we'll see you in the next episode for Backstage right back here. Take a bow, fellas.
Thanks, everybody.
See you.